Hello and welcome. My name is Doron Amaran. I'm a program manager here at the Climate Center, and I'll be your MC today for our webinar on building electrification. So thank you all for joining us. Before I turn things over to my colleague Woody Hastings to do a little framing for us, and then we dive deep with our amazing lineup of speakers, I would like to just introduce the subject and let you guys know a little bit about some of the folks who make this webinar possible. So I'm just going to do a quick screen share and we're going to get started here. So this webinar is part of the Climate Center's webinar series, Envisioning a Climate Safe California, Stories and Solutions. Really wanted to dive into personal stories and solutions in this year's webinar series, and this is part of that narrative. Today's webinar on building electrification is titled Stories from the Home Front. We all have homes, and all of us are concerned both in our own personal lives and as far as large buildings and institutions on how we can make those buildings safer, cleaner, and more resilient. We do have more webinars coming up in this series. The next one will be about a world beyond fossil fuels. We'll be talking about workers and how to protect them. We're talking about, after that, we'll have webinars on sequestering carbon on land and sea, and several more on extreme heat and others. But we will be taking a break in April from our webinar series and returning in May. And the reason for that is that in April, we are holding the California Climate Policy Summit in downtown Sacramento. This is going to be an incredible gathering of climate activists, policymakers, business leaders, and we invite you all to join us in Sacramento on April 11th. And if you would like to find out more, I'm going to ask my colleague Rob to drop a link into the chat so that you can find out more about this incredible event. If you're interested in sponsoring it, please contact us. If you'd like to exhibit there, we still have a little bit of space available. And of course, if you'd like to attend, we would love to have you join us on April 11th in downtown Sacramento for the California Climate Policy Summit. I'd like to take a moment to thank the many businesses that support the Climate Center and this work. And you can see the logos of the businesses that have supported this webinar here. I'd like to call out a couple of them in particular. Silicon Valley Clean Energy, that will be with us today. We will be hearing from a speaker from Silicon Valley Clean Energy, Tony Yulo. We're very happy he could be here. I'd also point out Sonoma Clean Power, another CCA like Silicon Valley Clean Energy that's very involved in this area. They've got incredible displays at their Advanced Energy Center in downtown Santa Rosa of all the electric appliances that you can use to replace your old gas appliances. So thanks to them and the other CCAs that you see here, Peninsula Clean Energy, MCE. Thanks also to the energy companies, Sunrun, Renewable America, RNA, Calpine Energy Solutions, LA Department of Water and Power. And I'd like to welcome our newest sponsor, Quit Carbon, which connects homeowners and contractors to allow you to have a smooth and easy pathway to electrifying your home and being part of the clean energy transition. So thank you, Quit Carbon, and all of our sponsors for helping make our work possible. Thank you also to our many webinar promotional partners. You can see some of them here. Grid Alternatives, Joint Venture, Climate Resolve, Acterra, Community Environmental Council, Civic Well, and others all help spread the word, and they're part of the reason why you're here with us today. Let's talk about what we're going to cover here today. First, we're going to hear from my colleague Woody Hastings, then Fatima Abdul Khabir from the Green Lining Institute, Tony Yulo from Silicon Valley Clean Energy, Becky Menton, the Building Decarbonization Coalition, and then Senator Josh Becker will be telling us a little bit about his personal story and some of the policy solutions that we need to achieve electrification more rapidly and equitably. Then we'll have an opportunity for Q&A. The last thing I'll say is we're very interested in knowing what you think. So please drop your questions into the Q&A portal now and throughout the webinar, and we will address all of those towards the second half of the webinar. We'll be doing our Q&A starting at 11 and really want your voice to be heard. You're also welcome to engage in the chat. But if you have questions for our speakers, we ask that you drop them in the Q&A portal and we will get to them later on. So with that note, I would like to thank you all for being here. I'm going to stop sharing, turn things over to my colleague, Woody Hastings. Woody, the floor is yours, my friend.
Thanks, Doron. Give me just a moment to share my screen here. And go to slideshow. All right, are my slides showing there? John? Hello?
No.
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 Desktop one. Let's see. Should be this one. Share screen.
Okay, what do you will?
Hold on just a moment. I got it. I'll get it. Sure. Share. Here we go.
There we go. All right.
All right.
There it is.
Of course, you know, we just tested this a moment ago and it worked fine. So
Looks good now, Woody.
something wrong. Good morning, folks. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Good. Good morning, folks. Woody Hastings with the Climate Center. Thanks all for joining. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about how building electrification, how it fits into our flagship campaign, Climate Safe California. Climate Safe California is a set of policies that will allow California to remove more climate pollution from the atmosphere than we emit by 2030, while creating thousands of jobs and building a more equitable, clean energy economy. We believe in thriving, healthy communities and envision a future where everyone in California benefits from equitable access to true climate solutions, from clean air to renewable energy, healthful food, and more. Addressing the roughly 25% of the statewide greenhouse gas emissions from buildings is a key part of the campaign. All of the Climate Center's work is guided by three core principles: adhering to the latest climate science, prioritizing climate justice for frontline communities, and securing a just transition for workers, their families, and communities. Our policy platform is built on 4 action pillars: phasing out polluting fuels from vehicles, electricity, homes, buildings, and more; scaling up natural carbon removal in soils and habitats; investing in resilient communities and clean energy systems; and unlocking public and private funding for climate action. In this webinar, the focus is mostly on the first one, phasing out polluting fuels, in this case from buildings. For details on the other parts of the program, visit the Climate Safe California page on our website.
Woody, I'll just point out a couple people
that are not properly insulated.
I'm sorry, I just want to point out a couple people saying they're having a little hard time hearing you. Just make sure your microphone is as close to your speaking hole as possible.
It is, and I will speak just a little louder. I hope it's not too loud for others. So people living in homes, I hope folks can hear me now, people living in homes that are not properly insulated or updated with the latest clean electric technology are uncomfortable, expensive to maintain, and often have indoor quality that is hazardous to health. The broader consequences of inefficiency and fossil gas in buildings, the climate crisis, are hitting harder and faster than scientists predicted even a few years ago. And California is ground zero for extreme climate impacts, once again disproportionately impacting those most vulnerable, least responsible, and least equipped to cope. A key part of advancing equitable building electrification is initiating programs and financing mechanisms that help lower income residents enjoy the benefits of electrification. And these are just a few of those benefits listed here. So, this is your opportunity to endorse Climate Safe California. Rob will drop the link of the endorsement page into the chat. Please, have a look at what is there. We have a pathway to actually achieving the goal in the detail underpinning documents. Have a look. If you like what you see, please endorse. You can endorse right now or take some time and read and endorse later. Climate Safe California is endorsed by hundreds of businesses, elected officials, nonprofits, more than 1,600 individuals, and we'd love to be able to add your name. And so I have a few things I want to sort of infomercials here. I want to announce a few things. I'm pleased to introduce, this is new for 2023, the Climate Center is hosting a new and improved bill tracker where it is searchable. You can just enter keywords into the bill tracker to track climate, energy, transportation, sequestration, adaptation, and of course, building electrification related bills. Rob, if you could also drop the link to the bill tracker into the chat, that would be great. And I think I might not have mentioned that to you, so it might take you a little time, but if you could do that, that would be wonderful. And then also, I must alert you all to the fact, if you don't already know, today, the Bay Area Air Quality Management District is going to be voting on a national first rule that will set standards for zero emission appliances. They will still be taking public comment well after 11 a.m. when this webinar ends. And so you'll have time to stay on this webinar the entire time, and then join. All of the information is in a link that Rob will drop in the chat about the Bay Area Air Quality Management District's meeting coming up. And I also want to announce that we have a report coming soon, later this month, on the issue of building electrification, and a very compelling new-ish financing mechanism called tariffed on-bill financing that Becky Menton will talk about a little bit more later. I just wanted to mention it now, and we've had really, really wonderful collaboration with the Building Decarbonization Coalition on this report, so happy to be collaborating with them on putting it together. That is my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me anytime. I love my job, and I love responding to folks that have questions, comments, or concerns about anything I'm doing, we're doing. And you'll see me later when we have the call to action, which is all about the budget cuts that have come to the Equitable Building Decarbonization Program. We don't want to let that happen. So that will be the call to action later on toward the end of the webinar. And I hand it back to you, Duran.
Thank you so much, Woody, and thank you for making it work. I'm happy to now introduce our next speaker. I'm not going to do full bios. Rob will drop the bios into the chat. I'll just tell you that Fatima works with the Green Lining Institute, and she's going to talk about obstacles low-income communities and communities of color face in building electrification. Thank you for the work you do, and we're excited to hear what you have to say today, Fatima.
Awesome. Thank you, Doran. Let me go ahead and share my screen. And can everyone see my screen okay? Good.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Well, good morning, everyone. Excited to be here today to talk to you a little more in depth on equitable building decarbonization issues. My name is Fatima Abdul-Kaber, she, her pronouns, and I am the Energy Equity Program Manager at the Green Lining Institute. So I'm going to start us off today by discussing the barriers and paths forward to equitable building decarbonization. So that means when we're having these conversations around decarbonizing California's existing building stock, that we are, one, ensuring that it's priority populations that are receiving benefits for building decarbonization first, and two, that policies and programs, whether at a local or state or federal level, are ensuring that they are accessible to priority populations, that they're maintaining or improving energy affordability, that they're including appropriate tenant protection requirements, and that they're also setting robust workforce standards in this growing industry. So that's a little bit of a sneak preview of what we're going to be diving into in the next 10 minutes. So I'll start off with an introduction to the Green Lining Institute. Green Lining is a racial equity policy advocacy organization. Our full mission statement is on the screen, and we have 30 years of history working in advocacy in California and now in other states and federally as well. And Green Lining was created to fight the lasting legacy of redlining, which was the illegal and systematic practice of excluding communities of color based on their race, the impacts of which carry through to modern day, which you can see at that map there at the bottom from 2018. Green Lining works in energy equity because energy equity is a racial justice issue. There's research, this is from the ACEEE study, that shows that the median energy burden for Black, Hispanic, and Native American households are all higher than that of white households. And energy burden refers to the percentage of annual household income that's spent on energy bills, and it's a factor that goes towards determining energy insecurity. So furthermore, directly related to our conversation today around building electrification, African Americans are more likely to live in older, less energy efficient homes. And this is the direct legacy of redlining. And these disparities that I'm talking about, they really highlight the need to uplift racial equity in all conversations around building decarbonization so that these priority populations are able to live in healthy and affordable homes. So moving into discussing some of the barriers to electrification that our priority communities are facing, and we're going to go through this on like various stages of a project or program or implementation, starting with cultural considerations. Just for the sake of time, since some of these barriers may be more familiar to folks, I'm going to be skipping over a couple of the ones listed out in the next couple slides, but happy to expand on any of the ones listed in the chat or in the Q&A later. So one, we have to recognize that there are simply just cultural reasons or traditional preferences that people have, like wanting to cook over a fire to char food items, and so might have a preference for gas stoves. Or, in other cases in California, more rural communities may have actually spent a significant amount of time advocating to get connected to the gas system and would then be understandably resistant to them being asked to electrify after, doing all that work to get to that stage. So to work within these perspectives to encourage electrification, we strongly recommend partnerships, compensated partnerships with community-based organizations or CBOs that are very familiar with their communities, they're familiar with their concerns, and more so they're trusted in the information that they provide. In the case study I'm going to talk about at the end, customer participation was driven primarily by one, energy savings, wanting to achieve energy savings, and two, improving home safety, which includes reducing indoor air pollutants. But also non-participants didn't indicate a concern for energy efficiency. So really how we frame electrification, focusing on health and cost savings, is very important, and CBOs are well positioned to do this outreach and education effectively. So let's move into talking about the financial barriers. So a lot of folks might already be familiar with the high upfront cost of electrification as a barrier. So starting off, we're going to talk about another potential affordability issue on the second point. One of the primary things that we want to avoid with households, with electrifying low-income households, is actually increasing their energy bills. And this is something that households are concerned about, where in the case study that I'm going to talk about, 66% of the non-participants of those pilots were concerned about bill increases as a barrier to participation. And they're justified with natural gas, typically because prices are quite high right now. Natural gas is typically cheaper than electricity. So there is that just caution to switching to electric appliances, actually increasing energy burden. This isn't always the case. There's a lot of low voltage appliances like 120 volt heat pumps that are becoming more popular in the market. And there's also, weatherization measure that you can utilize that can mitigate costs as well. But still, in some cases, you're adding additional electric load, also considering EVs. And so in some cases, higher bills are unavoidable. And to address this, we recommend that implementers move towards this one-stop shop model for holistic home electrification. So that's inclusive of weatherization, energy efficiency, and electrification upgrades, but it's also considering home and safety repairs that are needed, and even potentially DERs for households where increased bills seem likely. So we definitely recommend coordinating programs with existing low-income renewable energy programs like SOMA or SGIP or community solar programs as a way to alleviate those additional costs. And the last financial barrier listed here, it's a pretty well-known one around the split incentive with decarbonizing rental spaces. So I'm actually going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. The last set of barriers is around implementation. So I mentioned earlier that African Americans disproportionately live in older building stocks, which means that their homes are more likely to have health and safety issues like lead, asbestos, mold, and pest issues. And these are hazards that need to be addressed before weatherization or electrification upgrades. But oftentimes funding for electrification measures doesn't extend to cover these concerns. So there's less of a point in being able to upgrade to, a shiny new oven when your home is overwhelmed with a rat infestation. So there's really that need to take a holistic approach to these home upgrades. And these remediation efforts are not an insignificant cost. They can run as high as home electrifications can run as high as $150,000. So they really need to be considered in the financial scope of electrification projects. The last point I'm going to expand on is just following up on those issues I mentioned with decarbonizing rental spaces. Oh, sorry. When we target dollars towards electrifying homes for priority populations, we really want to ensure that, they are the ones actually receiving the benefits, and we also want to protect them against any negative outcomes. Landlords hold a lot of power, and when they electrify, whether it's by law or prompted by incentives, this can lead them to raising rents, to doing unlawful evictions, and even harassing tenants to try to get compensation for their investment. So one of our key recommendations is ensuring that any rental electrification program or policy or incentive includes those tenant protections in addition to incentivizing the landlords. And incentivizing landlords is an important piece to addressing the split incentive issue, as seen in the case study that I'm going to talk about next, where landlords indicated that their primary motivation to participate was to improve the value of their property. Okay, so now to discuss the case study that I've kind of been teasing throughout the slides. The SJV pilots are a really good example of a community-driven process that really looked into what it was like electrifying in priority communities and addressing a lot of the barriers that I've discussed today. So I'll drop the link to the full evaluation report for these pilots in a second, and that has a lot more detailed information and lessons learned. Just for a bit of context though, so the pilot took place in San Joaquin Valley, which is a diverse and rural area in California that has some of the highest levels of pollution in California as well. So the CBOs listed below have worked in these communities for decades, focusing on improving people's access to affordable housing and improving the health of Central Valley residents. And by directly working with families and community members, the organization Self-Help Enterprises identified over 170 communities across the valley that were never connected to the gas distribution grid and were left to burn wood or propane for heating and cooking. These are very high cost fuels, very volatile cost fuels with tremendous health impacts and safety concerns. So community members and activists, they rallied together and were able to successfully advocate for the creation and passage of legislation for the commission to then implement these electrification pilots. So that was a mix of IOUs and CBOs working together. There were 11 electrification pilots in total, and groups including Greenlining and Self-Help Enterprises conducted extensive outreach and education in the community to document the program's process with working through some of those barriers I discussed today around community outreach, bill savings, tenant protections, workforce training, local hiring requirements, all of those things. So where the pilot stands now, the PUC is considering next steps since a lot of the initial project scope has been concluded. And advocacy is really needed to ensure that this critical work continues in this region. So no time to go into these specific recommendations. I'm wrapping up, don't worry.
Thank you.
Okay, no time to go into the recommendations, but if you're interested, we did conclude work with partners to work on a more extensive comment letter to the CEC on that equitable building decarbonization program. And a lot of these recommendations are scalable at a local or regional level. So happy to speak more on that. Pass it over to you, Doran.
Thank you so much, Fatima. And I just want to recognize that all of our speakers have so much to say, and we really appreciate you condensing your comments so that we could hear from everybody. I know you're going to drop some links and people want to see the report, et cetera. So thank you for that. And I'm happy to now quickly introduce our next speaker from Silicon Valley Clean Energy, one of our partners, one of the supporters of the Climate Center, and more importantly, an organization that's doing a lot of important work as a CCA down in Silicon Valley. Tony Yulo, please tell us a little bit more from an energy service provider perspective.
Thanks much, and good morning, friends of the Climate Center. Tony Ulo with Silicon Valley Clean Energy, and I'm going to zip through some slides. Got 10 minutes here, so.
Yes, and we're looking at your calendar right now, which is
Ah,
there you go.
the best. Okay, you're seeing it now?
No, it's still your calendar, but it's good to see you've got a busy Wednesday.
Well, the best laid plans. We all practice this.
It worked
yet
fine
here
in the
we are.
practice session. Yeah, there we go.
Okay, I think we're better off here now, eh?
There we go.
Okay.
Thank you, Tony.
Electrification stories from the South Bay. For those of you who don't know who SVCE is, we are the CCA for the South Bay. We include all of the jurisdictions in Santa Clara County, except for Palo Alto and Santa Clara, because they have municipal utilities, and a little village you may have heard of called San Jose that has its own CCA. Our mission, unlike some CCAs, addressing climate change is built into our mission. We were not about necessarily trying to lower prices for our residents and businesses. Really, it's baked into our DNA as we're about addressing climate change. And we do that by looking at providing clean energy and building new renewable energy projects. Of course, accelerating the adoption of innovative electric technologies, and then looking at benefiting our community by reinvesting locally. Since we started in 2015, you can see a substantial reduction in our carbon footprint for our communities, looking at 4 million tons in 2015 before we started, and going down to nearly a 30% reduction in 2021, even after transportation emissions raised, after the pandemic. Note a couple of things on this slide. First off, the green areas are electricity emissions, and you can see that we've been very successful in reducing emissions from electricity. And then the second thing to notice is that the yellow and sort of mustard colored emissions have not gone down at all. Those would be those from gas. If you're wondering why there's a little bit of green left, those are primarily the direct access business customers that do not use our electricity, but can go out in the market and get electricity from any source that they desire. So when you're looking at emissions like that, really you have 4 paths to continue further. You could reduce emissions. You could double down on carbon capture. You could hope that green hydrogen comes around, or you could be an ostrich. We are Team A, or for those of you who are fans of old television shows, the A Team. So we're focusing on reducing emissions. When you look at our emissions, it's almost a 50-50 split between transportation and built environment. And while we do a lot of work to facilitate the development of EV infrastructure, that's not the topic of today's talk. So we'll be focusing on the built environment, which is of course the higher and kind of steeper bar to climb for us at the local level, because the state has set some pretty substantial policy rules in place to guide EVI and EVs being adopted. So when we look at this right side of the building emissions, you can see again a little bit of green, but a whole lot of that orange and yellow color. And that's the natural gas embedded in buildings. There's some, as you can see, the green is still there. And there's some amount of the emissions in the non-residential buildings that are going to be really tough to handle because those are industrial processes, not heating and cooling. When we look at what this takes, getting there is, we're looking at 1 million machines that need to be replaced. So while roughly half of those are on the top of this chart, which are representing those in emissions associated with transportation, when we get down to our building stock, we see that that's 165,000 water heaters, space heaters, pardon me, 230,000 water heaters, 125,000 stoves, some pretty significant numbers on the numbers of machines that need to be electrified in order for us to get down to the state's climate goals. So it's a steep mountain to climb, and there we are. So we've discovered and talked about, really there's a three-legged stool that's needed to get us there. One is regulations. So rules that prohibit the sale and installation of polluting devices. And hopefully, as we're here today, the Bay Area Air Quality Management District is in the process of doing that for a significant number of those machines that need to be replaced. Secondly is assistance, whether it's direct financial assistance, rebates, et cetera. Concierge services, which means assisting property owners in finding the best way to electrify their building. Doing direct installations, particularly in multifamily settings where a property owner can engage with us and someone would go out and directly install devices into their property. And lastly, innovative financing. And I think that Becky's going to talk about on-bill tariff. There's all kinds of other approaches that people are evaluating as to how to make the financing of these improvements accessible to all. And the third part is the change infrastructure. So whether it's doing training to facilitate the number of contractors that are available, whether it's modernizing permitting so that the permits aren't a problem to get this done, or engaging in cheerleading from the sidelines. All those things are really important to make this movement. And I want to highlight the one thing that we have some direct control on is rate design, since we do charge rates. And so we're doing everything we can to ensure that electric rates are competitive with gas so that going electric does not result in significant bill impacts. So in this area, we're not just team A, we're teams A, B, and C. We're looking at all three of these areas. This gives you a snapshot of some of the programs we have in place or are going to be developing to assist. We have whole home incentives currently in place. I'll show you a slide in a moment about those. We're looking at developing better concierge services because there's so many questions that come up when people are electrifying their home. Certainly a water heater loaner program is something to consider, particularly for those that haven't planned ahead. In our whole home incentives currently, there's pre-wiring available so that someone can pre-wire their house for an electric water heater, and then when their gas water heater goes out, it isn't a problem to get an electric replacement. I mentioned before, particularly in the multifamily area, doing the direct install program, and then also the financing. So you can see the kind of the timelines that we have on the bottom and about how many households are going to be addressed by these programs. You can see there's a lot of households remaining in terms of our financing currently, and for that matter, all the states and federal government's financing as well. This is the program that we currently have up and running. It's called Future Fit Homes, and people can get up to $8,000 to switch to clean electric appliances. Our rebates are in addition to those available from the IRA and BayREN. So this is all additive, and people can get some pretty efficient electric appliances using a combination of programs. Our recent analysis looks at, just for electric water heater changeout using a heat pump, average cost of maybe approximately $4,800 for a changeout. And for everyone, the rebates and other assistance is enough to make it cheaper than a gas replacement. And for those that are low income, it actually can be free by the time you get all of the rebates that will be available next year through the IRA. Okay, we were asked to think about making this real for everyone. And I so appreciate Fatimi's earlier presentation for a number of reasons. Of course, all the experience that they bring to this, but also her pointing out that the existing status quo for folks, the low-income folks are already getting the short end of the deal. They're already most likely to be energy burdened. If you think about it, they're most likely to be living in homes that are in areas with bad air pollution, whether it's near a refinery or what have you. They're most likely to be living in smaller apartments without proper ventilation for a gas stove. So they're already, with the status quo, getting the bad end of the deal. So everything that we can do to get them to transition will be to the better. So when we look at meeting people where they are, we have to look at the housing type, the age of the housing, the type of occupancy, whether it's owner occupied or rental, and of course their income level. And this is a work in progress. I don't think anyone would pretend that they have this all figured out, but we're all doing what we can, and these programs are evolving rapidly. Of course, it's wonderful that the federal rebates, if you haven't looked at them, that will be in place hopefully next year. They phase out at higher income levels because, just looking at myself, we were able to self-finance getting a heat pump. We're able to self-finance getting an induction cooktop. I don't need that to be free, but other people do. And so to the extent that the federal government is focusing the deepest rebates for those that are more deeply in need, that's really a welcome sign. When we look at our area in our zone, we have a lot more single family homes than multifamily homes, roughly, it's a 2/3, 1/3 mix. And in this chart, you can see that a significant number of those single family homes are owned. And so, as you might expect on the multifamily side, it's direct opposite, that most of those are rented. This is like my favorite bar chart in the world. And it's really cool in a number of ways. First off, you can see that the bars themselves show the number of overall homes built per decade. And then embedded in those bars is the type of home, or the type of building that we were talking about. And then at the bottom, you get to some really great factors, which is the older the home is, the more likely it is to need a panel replacement. And while there's lots of work being done to minimize the need for panel replacements, some of these houses have really decrepit electrical infrastructure and even 70 amp panels. So it becomes very difficult to electrify. So the older the home, the more likely it is to have a small panel or a panel that's in need of replacement. As you go up the chart, you see 200 amp service started in the 80s. If your house was built prior to 2000, you can get your gas service removed for free. And then the latest challenge is instantaneous gas water heaters, and so which don't have room for tank replacements. And so with that, I'm going to just zip through. We have an equity framework in place. We use something called a SEVI index, which looks at the people's vulnerability based on a number of factors. You can see the map. You can see, as you might expect, the lower income areas have the highest. And with that, I'll sign off. There are more slides after this when these are distributed for your ongoing enjoyment. But with that, I will say thank you very much, and I look forward to some questions.
Thank you, Tony. We really appreciate it. And once again, you've got so much to cover. We appreciate you getting so much in a short amount of time. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our next speaker from the Building Decarbonization Coalition, Becky Menton. Becky, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Thank you very much. First off, a bit of a warning. I've been struggling with internet this morning, so hopefully I don't freeze and drop mid-presentation, but in case I do, we have a backup plan. So bear with me if that's the case. I'm very happy to be here. The Building Decarbonization Coalition is a membership-based coalition. We represent folks from NGOs to manufacturers and industry to local governments. We have a pretty broad reach, and we try to balance perspectives in advocating for policies that promote and help building electrification. So let me share my screen here and we can get started. So the first thing I want to mention is that California's agencies, and really increasingly its legislator, are starting to coalesce around the fact that building electrification is really a foundational element of our pathway towards climate mitigation. Building and transportation electrification were noted in this report that I screenshotted here as the least cost pathways to achieving our carbon goals. We know that all electric buildings are safer, both for the environment and for their occupants. However, a theme that you're hearing today that I really want to underscore is that while there's tremendous upside from building electrification, it's really a triple bottom line solution. Many who could benefit the most, increasingly like low-income BIPOC communities who live in areas of deferred housing maintenance and high environmental air pollution, may actually be left behind in this transition. So it's very important as we take on the building electrification movement that we be very focused on that issue. I also want to pause and acknowledge that we have a lot to celebrate right now. I pulled these tidbits from our recent Innovation Acceleration Report at the Building Decarbonization Coalition, which is sort of a snapshot of where we are right now, the successes and the challenges. Obviously, the Inflation Reduction Act was really historic, and the level of investment that was directed both towards building decarbonization and broader climate solutions. For the first time in 2022, heat pump shipments outpaced gas furnaces. That's incredible. And Stovegate, as some of you may have seen or heard in the media, actually piqued America's interest in induction. There were higher numbers of Google searches related to induction, as well as heat pumps in January, as a result of all the press and attention that Stovegate has caused. So it's not all bad. Even with all of these national successes, California itself has really been a leader on building electrification. Last year, the legislature committed $1.1 billion for decarbonizing homes. That's incredible. The TEC program, which is a market rate incentive-based program that's tied to contractors, dispersed more than $30 million in incentives. That's nearly 10,000 heat pump HVAC and more than 1,000 heat pump water heaters that were installed in California between August of 2001 and January of 2023. However, keeping with the theme, I also want to point out that less than $3 million of those $30 million in incentives was dispersed in disadvantaged community areas. So while we're doing great, we definitely should do better. Building codes have been a really strong leverage point in California to address building efficiency and building electrification. The California Energy Commission, as many of you know, sets standards on energy and construction, and they've been ratcheting up their standards over a 3-year cycle since 1978. The building code that came into effect in 2022 has a strong emphasis on all electric construction, and that's great for new construction. In addition, more than 75 local jurisdictions in California have adopted some form of an electric preferred reach code through their local authority. That means actually across the nation, 1 in 5 communities live in an area that's covered by an electric preferred reach code of some kind or another. Air quality agencies are beginning to act on the link between gas combustion and harmful pollutants. There's a growing body of evidence that links the combustion of natural gas to indoor air quality impacts and outdoor pollution. The Air Resources Board is committed to phasing out the sale of gas appliances by 2030. They're working on a rulemaking there. And the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, as was already acknowledged today, is voting on a historic first-time local ban of gas appliance sales. Not a history local ban. Oops, first typo found. However, as I acknowledged with the TEC program, that is all great, but it's not really focusing on how we ensure that many of the communities who have been historically marginalized and left out of our programs actually are able to be some of the first movers and first takers of this building electrification movement. Some of these tidbits are pulled from the forthcoming Climate Center report. We're very excited to see that hit the streets because it has some really important takeaways, particularly for regulators and decision makers. One thing to note, while we have this historic investment through the IRA, through the legislature's budget last year, there's still a significant funding gap. The report estimates that just heat pump HVAC installations in 70% of California's low to moderate income housing could cost up to $32 billion. And that's just, again, focusing in on those low to moderate income populations in California. While we've gained significant ground in the form of local reach codes, the vast majority of those reach codes are really concentrated in coastal city areas. That leaves customers in the Central Valley who are increasingly suffering from extreme heat out of the electrification movement. And I want to remind folks, in case you're not familiar with the technology, that every heat pump furnace is also an AC unit. So being able to replace furnaces, with heat pumps actually could enable air conditioning for homes that don't already have it. Another point that I think is really important for folks to keep in mind is that incentive-based programs don't always work well for all customers. Even with a robust incentive program, sometimes the installation cost of these measures, particularly paired with energy efficiency, which is really important for the affordability and the operation of the building, that leaves a significant gap that some customers can't cover, the gap between the install cost and the incentive. Those upfront costs can keep customers out of participating in these programs and getting these improvements on their home. That's part of why we think tariffed on-bill financing is a really interesting solution. We'll be talking about that in a second. Another really important note is that we have an existing gas distribution infrastructure system in the state, and it's paid for by customers who receive those gas benefits. As more and more customers begin departing the gas system because they recognize the advantages of all electric buildings, that shrinks the number of customers who have to pay for the fixed costs of managing our gas distribution system. This could increase affordability burdens for customers if we're not thoughtful about how we plan this transition. Similarly, there's a significant workforce in California who maintains that distribution infrastructure, who works on that gas system. We need to make sure that we're very thoughtful about giving clear signals about moving away from the gas system and really investing in job transition strategies and workforce investment strategies that ensure that there are high road job opportunities, well-paid union labor opportunities available in that building electrification movement. And finally, there are a lot of soft costs associated with installing building electrification. The workforce isn't necessarily familiar, supply chains need to be spun up. This really creates an opportunity for local innovation, especially around things like local permitting. So I mentioned some of this, but again, features of what counts as a thoughtful transition, really meaningful and focused investment in low-income and BIPOC communities, making sure there are programs that work for those customers, making sure they're focused in areas that have been historically underinvested in. Planning the transition for the existing natural gas infrastructure. Let's stop continuing to invest in a system that we know we're moving away from and start being thoughtful about where those investments take place, including in a workforce transition and workforce development strategy. And a real focus on affordability, both of installation and operation of all electric homes. This means meaningful, streamlined incentives, direct install programs such as the Equitable Building Decarbonization Program that the Energy Commission will be launching soon. Affordable financing, again, a hint for the tariffed on-bill discussion, and thoughtful rate design that helps make sure the operational costs of these all-electric buildings can be managed by their occupants. So I'd mentioned we'd be doing a deep dive into tariffed on-bill financing. I want to take a brief moment to differentiate tariffed on-bill financing from on-bill financing. California has had on-bill financing programs where you work with a third-party lender to get approved for financing, and then you're able to repay that charge on your utility bill. There are a lot of advantages to those programs, but one significant disadvantage is that it still requires the accessibility of that financing to be based on the credit worthiness and income of the building occupant. Tariffed on-bill financing has the utility actually making an investment in the form of a tariff and recovering that investment through the utility rates. Therefore, it's tied to the building meter, not to the building occupant. This allows for expanded access to financing because you're evaluating the merits of the project, not the merits of the building occupant. And it can potentially overcome the landlord-tenant split incentive because it's the person paying the utility bills who's presumably also receiving the benefits of this more efficient equipment, who's paying the cost of that. These programs can also be paired with third-party capital, which really allows us to scale up the investment. That $32 billion figure I quoted earlier is never going to be something that we should expect Californians to pay through taxes, through higher rates. We have to attract third-party investment if we're going to achieve those goals. Tariffed on-bill financing allows a third-party investment to carry on that meter. It could also lower the perceived risk to the lenders because it's on the bill, which also has the advantage of potentially reducing the interest rates that could be applied to these programs. However, you definitely need to keep in mind some specific best practices when you're looking at this tariff-based financing. For one thing, you need to make sure that you're actually delivering on that commitment of expanded access to financing. If you're using a meter-based program, you should not be evaluating the creditworthiness of any individual occupant. It should solely be based on the merits of the project. You also should make sure that the utility cost recovery leaves some opportunity for the building occupant to partake in the savings. An example would be like an 80-20 split. If the customer is if the utility is collecting on 80%, that leaves 20% of the savings available to the customer. Automatic succession from one customer to the next requires clear notification. You should make sure that you're installing only proven technologies, and you should allow the customer obligation to transfer automatically as long as you have those customer notifications in place. That was very whirlwind, but I will say we're awaiting a CPUC decision to approve tariff on bill financing. My wonderful co-speaker, Senator Becker, had some legislation in the last session that would allow the CEC to leverage federal funding in support of these programs. So as soon as we get that decision from the CPUC, we'll be able to tie this all together and get these programs rolling. Thank you all very much. And I await questions in the chat.
Thank you so much, Becky. We really appreciate it. And I do encourage all our speakers to kind of go back and look at the Q&A in the chat and answer any questions that you can. We will not have time for all of the amazing questions that are coming in. But I'd like, before we get to Q&A, to turn it over to the recently aforementioned Senator Josh Becker, representing the 13th Senate District in San Mateo County. So a lot of this is happening in your neck of the woods. And I believe you've got some personal experience in this area too, Senator. So tell us about your personal story and the policy levers that we're trying to get in place to accelerate this transition in an equitable way.
Absolutely. Happy to. Thanks for having me here today as part of this panel. While we are in the early stages in some ways of electrification, there's just tremendous momentum, and you've heard about a lot of that today. And I apologize if I repeat some. I had to take a couple calls during this, so if I repeat something that's been said, I apologize. Yeah, couldn't be more excited about the conversation today. And as you mentioned, yes, did go through this with our own house as well. And, we didn't need air conditioning, 20, 30 years ago in Menlo Park. It was really hot. On the second floor, we have bedroom there, 8 days a year, and then it was 20 days a year, and then it was 30 to 40 days a year. It was sort of oppressive. And with the heat pump, we get both air conditioning and greenhouse gas free heating and electric hot water heating as well. And so that's been wonderful to see. But I did want to talk a little bit about a couple of things. I want to talk about motivation, some of the barriers, and some of the stuff that we're working on up here to help speed this process. As I said, to some extent, we are in the early days compared to other areas like renewables. Our grid is almost about 40% renewable here in California. So some dramatic increases from a few years ago with our policies. And renewables are expected to add more than 80% of the new capacity nationwide in 2023. So the new capacity added to grids nationwide, about 80% of that is expected to be renewables. As you know, the shift to electric vehicles is also happening, especially in my district, quite rapidly. More than 50% of the new cars sold in San Mateo County last year are electric vehicles. So tremendous speed of that transition. But most buildings are not new. We have made great progress, and was proud to be on the board of Menlo Park. We passed the first all-electric new building REACH code, and now I think it's been mentioned 1 in 5 Americans is living in a municipality where they have an all-electric new REACH code. But we still do have to think about these existing buildings. And again, even if you're quite motivated, there are challenges that people have mentioned here, and I think that's what we're working on today, and that's why the Bay Area Quality Management District proposal today is so important. I was happy at the last minute rally that got 3 of my colleagues, Bay Area colleagues, to sign on as well, and including new colleague Damon Connolly, who's vice chair of the Joint Climate Change Committee now. And Senator Wiener, Phil Ting, other people who've been leaders in this area as well. But we need legislation as well and regulation. And so one of the things that we're working on for larger buildings is building performance standards. And this is something that my college classmate, Clifton Jersey Institute of Market Transformation, have been working on for a long time now. And Washington State and Colorado have done some really good work there. Maryland more recently did a version of this. But we need to measure building energy usage and require large buildings to improve their efficiency and reduce their greenhouse gas emissions over time. The CEC was already starting to do benchmarking, and we should know what a large building in a certain area of a certain square foot in a certain area, what their energy profile should be, and really what their water use profile should be. We're actually, for the first time ever, we're using adding water into this. And so my bill, which is SB 48, for those keeping track at home, will put California on the path to have building performance standards as well. And it's important because it focuses both on emissions reductions and efficiency. If we just swap out gas appliances and don't add the efficiency, we're not going to allow people to have the full equitable transition. So we do think that's important to both restrict the appliance sales, but also institute these building performance standards with efficiency, and that will strongly motivate the switch away from gas in those larger buildings. But again, a lot of, we talk about barriers, and one of the barriers is, if it takes 6 months for PG&E to do an upgrade or something that's required, that's obviously a massive obstacle. I tried to tackle this my very first year with a bill I had called SB 68, and we'll talk about parts of that did get through, but unfortunately the faster timeline requirement got stripped out of it. And now more and more people are recognizing this problem. So I'm back again with a attempt at this that I'm pretty optimistic of, and this will be SB 410 this year, which will require utilities to report on how long these upgrades are taking, require the PUC to set targets, and work with utilities on how to speed this up. So that's not the only barrier, but that's a big barrier and one that we are tackling to make sure. The other thing is, we talked about the shortage of people with skills and experience to do this work, shortage of electricians and heat pump experience among most contractors. So some of these workforce shortages will solve themselves once people realize there's good work to be had in this field. But we also need an intentional effort to maximize the training pipeline to get skilled workers into these jobs. And another barrier is that current incentives are very scattered. When I do this with my home, and then people call you up weeks later, hey, we need bay rent, we need these folks to come in and do an inspection to make sure you get this incentive and that incentive, and you're running around trying to deal with kids and work, and it can be very confusing. And now the great news is, as I'll mention, we have federal incentives as well, but how do all those things work together? I was speaking to the Knight Hennessy scholars at Stanford. Woman asked this very wonky question about stacking incentives. I introduced her to Ken on my team, and lo and behold, now she made a suggestion, and she interned actually, I think, for the CEC, maybe the CPUC as well. And we have a bill this year, SB 755, SB 755, that will create a one-stop shop application to CEC for all decarbonization energy saving programs. So this, for anyone who's gone through this, you realize the importance of this, especially as we add more incentives, which is great. We need to make it easier to understand and capture all the incentives that will qualify for. By the way, I should mention as well, I've been approached by 3 startups recently. I'm really encouraged to see lots of startups out there that are tackling different parts of this as well, helping people in their homes understanding what the potential is for upgrades, helping connect people up to contractors when they have a lot of information, really surfacing then great leads to contractors, and helping with financing. So different parts of the ecosystem. It's been wonderful to see people I know who have been entrepreneurs in many other areas now coming to this area and say, I specifically want to work on home electrification. We also, along those lines, continue to need new technologies. And the part of my SB 68 from 2020 that did pass, one of the pieces was about better technology and directing the CEC to support R&D funding, which it can through its EPIC programs, that many of you know about. But to support R&D funding for technologies that can do building decarb faster and cheaper, and to publish best practices as guidance for building owners and contractors. So what are some examples of technologies that can help speed decarbonization? Well, for example, there are new water heaters coming out that use less power and can plug into a regular 110 volt outlet. So besides reducing the need for a panel upgrade, you can also avoid the cost of getting an electrician to install a new circuit for your water heater in that case. Another way to avoid a panel upgrade is use a smart panel or circuit sharing technology that allows more devices to be connected while preventing overloads. For example, you can automatically pause your car charger if your dryer or your stove temporarily needs extra power that would exceed your panel's limit. Another great solution is a new induction stove that can plug into a standard 110 volt outlet. That can avoid the cost of installing a new 50A circuit, which can be $1,000 or more, and again, reduce the chance of needing a service upgrade. And the stove can work with so little power because it's got a built-in battery that allows you to draw power slowly all day, and then use bursts of power from the battery when you need it briefly to boil that pot of water. And that battery also means you can always cook even during a power outage. So that's ingenious. Harvest Thermal, another great technology, actually allowing people to load shift their heating. And I know we're wrapping up here, so I won't go in all the details there. But this is important, that technology, and again, everything we're doing here will encourage entrepreneurs. Lastly, money is an important piece of all this, and we talked about some of the incentives, and we'll make it easier to access in the legislature. And I now chair the budget subcommittee that does all climate, all natural resources. So we work on this area, and the legislature, we approved $200 million we played $1 billion overall, but $200 million specifically for equitable building decarbonization program, which is money for appliance rebates, and majority of that going to direct install for low-income buildings. And then you heard about SB 112 from last year around tariff on bill financing. So lots to do, and I'm certainly working hard on it, as are many of my colleagues. That's really my to-do list. So thankful for the Climate Center and all the panelists today. It's exciting. I want to go back and watch all the, I got snippets. I want to watch all the recordings about San Joaquin Valley and all the pilots there and all the great work that's happening. So I appreciate the Climate Center being a great partner with the legislature.
Well, thank you, Senator Becker. We appreciate you being here. And I really just want to kind of lean on a point that you made, that the policy is really setting the stage for the private sector to step in with new startups and new innovation. And we see some of that with some of our partners here today, like Quit Carbon and Sunrun and some of these other companies that are working in these areas, both large established ones and new startups. So that's very exciting. I'd like to turn to our Q&A now. So I'd like to invite Tony, Fatima, and Becky to all turn on your cameras, because I want to do this in a kind of a conversational way. And I'm going to start with some questions. I may pitch them to you. If you'd like to contribute, you can put your hand up, old school, and I'll see you, and we can move to our Q&A. I'd like to start with the Q&A, and Fatima, I'll start with you, and then we'll pass this around the room. And it was addressed a little bit. We've got a lot of questions on split incentives, particularly for renters, right? Like, who owns the stuff versus who pays the bill? And this is a real challenge. And I'm curious how all of you, from your different perspectives, community, CCA, industry organization, policymaker, how you view programs and plans to overcome the split incentives. Who pays for the heat pump versus who pays for the bill? It seems like we've got a real challenge there, especially for renters. Fatima, what have you seen in this area, and how do you think we can address this important question?
Yeah, starting off with the soft questions. Thank you. So, I mean, this is one of the biggest issues facing when we're talking about building decarbonization in low-income communities, because primarily low-income communities are renters. They don't own property. So there's this huge issue that we're facing. And where it starts is really, as I've been saying throughout my presentation, is whenever we have conversations around building decarbonization, we really need to be thinking about the tenant protection component. And, you know, I hear a lot of words being thrown around like equitable this program, equitable that program, but without these core protections and requirements in these policies, then it's not equitable. It's not having those protections for the populations that we're trying to protect. So To start off, we need to have these considerations included in the policies. And then beyond just including, requiring tenant protections, we also need to think about the enforcement. And I think this is the part that falls off in a lot of the policies at different levels is, we have all of these things, and then it's hard to figure out, what agency or who's actually holding these protections accountable. And in a lot of cases, I think there was a question in the chat. There aren't any enforcement units or anything because partially they're not included in the policies. So there's that lack of connection. So one way is to make sure when we're creating new policies and when we're looking at existing policies to ensure that we're not only including tenant protections, but we're also considering the enforcement and accountability element as well. Hope that answered, took a stab at answering that.
Yeah, that's a good start. I'd like to hear from some of the other folks. Tony at Silicon Valley Clean Energy, how are you addressing this thorny issue?
Well, I appreciate that it is thorny. So really, to start with, we're looking at making sure that our dollars aren't all going to rich people, just frankly, because, the dollars come from all of the ratepayers. And so we want to be sure that all of our incentives aren't just going to those that can most easily access them. And so for that reason, when we look at a direct install multifamily program, for example, we're talking about stuff happening without cost. So I am not an expert in renter protection, admittedly. I would hope that if an improvement is being funded not by the landlord, that it's very difficult in given state law to use that as a justification to raise rents. Obviously, the state is addressing rental protection and will continue to do that. And I understand the frustration. Clearly, we failed as a society to protect lots of folks. And clearly, there's lots of work to be done there. From our perspective, we're just trying to make sure that our dollars are not all going to the rich people and that we're getting to those more vulnerable populations. Because going back to something I said, those folks living in those low-income apartments are most likely to be burdened by pollution today as we sit here. And so we want to do everything we can to expedite them getting access to clean appliances.
Thank you, Tony. Appreciate that. Appreciate the work you guys are doing in this area. Becker, you've got kind of a broader perspective, statewide perspective. What are you seeing in different communities? How are we ensuring that maybe mandating a landlord to do something doesn't wind up raising the rents on the people who are living there?
It's a really tricky issue because, as others have noted, it becomes an enforcement question. It varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Some places like San Francisco have good rent control policies, others don't. A more exacerbating issue, of course, is the idea of naturally occurring multi-affordable housing. This is an instance where we have customers who are at lower incomes, but not necessarily living in like protected, affordable, subsidized multifamily, which becomes even more challenging. It's harder to identify these customers. It's harder to protect them. So I really don't have any solutions. I think Fatima and Greenlining are really leading in this place. So I just kind of defer to their solutions here.
Thank you so much, Becky. And Senator Becker, we're talking about split incentives. Landlord might have to pay for the device, and the tenant may have to pay for the bill. Is there anything you're looking at from a policy perspective to help protect tenants and lower income folks from the increased rents or increased rates?
We'll have to run out, but I had to run out from it. But tariff on bill financing, as mentioned, should help with this issue as well, because people who are benefiting it from then pay more of a monthly over time. So that should really help with that. And we do have certainly have protections into SB 48. We spent a lot of time, spent a whole year before we launched the bill, meeting with environmental justice groups to make sure that there were safeguards in there to make sure it wasn't used to raise the cost of multifamily. So I think there's stuff we're trying to do there.
I appreciate that. And for our next question, I'd like to sort of like flip it. We're going to go from inside the home to outside the home. And I'll do this in reverse order. We'll start with you, Senator Becker. We've had a number of questions in the Q&A in the chat talking about challenges with the infrastructure, PG&E, for example. One person comments, keeps giving different reasons why we can't go electric. Electric is too close to gas lines. Homeowners have to pay for the upgrade, load capacity on the street electricity. The transformer can't handle any more electricity, and that's slowing things down. So as far as the infrastructure challenges and working with the IOUs and the big utilities, again, from a policy perspective, what are some of the things that we're trying to do here in California? I know you mentioned some of these in your comments, but perhaps a slightly deeper dive into this important issue of the infrastructure outside the homes that's essential to allow us to electrify inside our homes.
Good. Well, again, we need all of your voice in here. The legislature will be looking at many bills this year, including my SB 410. That's a bill that's going to focus, as I mentioned, on this interconnection issue. But also, and Lawrence mentioned, I was really sorry to hear about IBEW workers being laid off. This will actually create more predictable work for them. I think in the way that we're trying to do, they're actually working with IBEW on this legislation. So I hope that will be helpful. But yeah, it's gotten to a critical stage. Again, I tackled this 2 years ago because it was important, but now I want to say it's like almost a crisis, literally, where people are. I just got a call from the mayor of San Jose that Kaiser's considering not doing this like $1 billion upgrade because they're worried that PG&E won't be able to hook them up. So it's gotten really critical. We need a sophisticated solution. That's what we're trying to work on there. Yeah, there's lots to be done, but I'm confident that we can. I'm confident we can get the infrastructure in place.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Senator Becker. Tony, I'd like to turn to you to address this issue. You work for a CCA. You guys have to tangle with the utilities all the time. In what instances have you seen this challenge come up, and what are some of the ways you're trying to address it?
Well, all the concerns are certainly based on fact. We've heard lots of stories from people. So few approaches. One, as we've talked about in the chat and other places here today, let's avoid panel upgrades whenever we can. Let's try to deal with the infrastructure as it is today and look for innovative ways to share that electricity to meet our needs. Secondly, we are very hopeful that we can work cooperatively with PG&E, and they're very supportive of this, on looking at areas where the gas infrastructure can be eliminated, and so that the money that would have gone into upgrading the gas infrastructure where those maintenance needs are critical can be instead go into improving the electrical infrastructure in that neighborhood and eliminate gas entirely in the neighborhood. So there's dollars that would be made available through that for kind of whole neighborhood electrification. It's called pruning in general. Senator Becker, doing some sort of modernization or reform on the obligation to serve issue is something that's needed at the state level. Sorry for a little poke there, but that's where we're at. We let's be clear. We have a very cooperative relationship with PG&E and rely on them to deliver electricity. So I just want to push back a little bit on your doing battle with them comment, because
Thank you.
they are our partners in providing electricity service to our customers.
Absolutely. Much appreciated. Thank you for that perspective. Fatima, I don't know if a Green Lighting Institute has run into these issues in some of the communities that you work in. Perhaps the challenges are a little bit different. I'm curious as to your perspective on this issue.
Yeah, sure. So we don't directly work on interconnection issues, but when we're thinking about just in general, any energy scale project, it's a grid-wide issue. But when we're thinking about what projects to prioritize, we should also be thinking about projects that are going to help support the communities that are most impacted. So the ones that experience brownouts and blackouts most frequently are low-income communities in predominantly areas of color as well. So considering that when we're thinking about interconnection, considering prioritizing community solar projects and projects and connections that actually work within the community to build wealth and keeping the benefits within the community. So I'd say that's our perspective.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And Becky, again, with your statewide perspective and perhaps even broader, perhaps you can address this issue as well. What are some innovations that you've seen in trying to overcome this challenge?
I was actually going to answer this from a slightly different perspective. We're looking more and more at zonal decarbonization as a potential solution for really focusing investment in the communities that have been underserved and aggregating installation so that both we can create more opportunities for skilled and trained labor, as well as really have this like planned transition. And something like that can really help the utility. They have sight lines to where this investment is going to take place. They can be aware of some of the distribution system issues on the electricity side that need to be addressed, and can really do this in a more thoughtful perspective. Appliance by appliance switch outs are still going to be a part of our solution, but increasingly we're looking at these zonal decarbonization opportunities as a really good chance to kind of look at this holistically.
Great. Excellent. I appreciate that. It's sort of related. It's not infrastructure, but it's permits. I mean, we've had a number of questions on permits. Who pays for the permits? And to what extent does getting the permits present a challenge? Might there be policy levers available to smooth permitting for individuals, for contractors? I'm curious who wants to talk about permits. Tony turned on his microphone, so I think Tony's got something to say.
I'll start. So there's a lot of attention paid to permitting as a source of a problem. And we're actually very actively looking at that issue right now. We're in the middle of a project, but here's what we've uncovered so far is that some agencies at the local level have permitting impediments. For example, it may be harder to get a permit for an electric heat pump water heater than to do a gas like-for-like replacement. And so there's an opportunity there to work with local agencies on making that at least equivalent. Secondly, we're looking at some work to how can permitting be incentivized? So perhaps we could subsidize the price of permitting for electric, for that heat pump water heater. Maybe SVCE is going to pay the bill so that it becomes a zero cost permit. The capabilities of local agencies to process permits and do the inspections in a timely manner vary. Just like everything else with every different governmental entity, there is different resources brought to bear, different factors. And so we're looking at working with all 13 of our jurisdictions on customized solutions to help them.
Thank you so much. Becky, have you had any thoughts on permitting? What have you seen, again, in different communities? You've got this sort of multi-community approach. I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
And full disclosure, I recently worked at East Bay Community Energy, a CCA, in Alameda County, and also the San Joaquin County. And that's actually where I encountered the most boots on the ground experience with permitting. And I answered this in the chat, but I have heard that some contractors and installers will quote projects differently based on the jurisdiction they're in and based on their previous experiences with the plan checker, building inspector, permitting experience. So I really do think that this is a strong opportunity for there to be some local innovation and local action on this. The Bay Area Regional Energy Network, which is a coalition of governments that are administering energy efficiency incentives in California, have been doing training for plan checkers and building inspectors to help really streamline that process. It shouldn't be more difficult, but it's new, and we should expect that there would be a learning curve associated with that and provide support for those local jurisdictions as they are, in charge of implementing a lot of the components of this transition.
Thank you. And Fatima, these challenges are probably even more acute in some of the communities that you work in. And have you got anything you want to contribute to this thorny question of permitting?
Not particularly an area that I'm engaged in, so I will defer to my expert colleagues.
All right, no problem. I just wanted to give you an opportunity. We've got time probably for one more question. So Fatima, you pointed out earlier that we started with perhaps easier ones. This one perhaps a little bit more juicy, we might say. I'm going to combine a couple of questions that people asked. California may look like a leader in some respects, but on the other hand, the CPUC just made rooftop solar, less affordable and attractive with their recent decision in December. So where are we going in two different directions? And I'm going to quote another questioner here. Sounds like California needs to bring down the hammer on counties and utilities to speed things up. So I guess the question for all of you is, do we need to bring down the hammer, or is there perhaps a softer tool that we can use in order to speed things up. I think we all agree things need to be accelerated, but I'm going to go around to each of you in the order that you spoke at the first to begin. So we'll start with Fatima, Tony, then Becky, and Josh. For this final question, is California moving in two directions? How do we speed things up? Is it time to bring down the hammer? Fatima?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think overall California understands the direction that we need to be moving in. However, when we see things like cuts to equity programs and the climate equity programs, particularly in the state budget, we have to consider what are we prioritizing here? When we are keeping nuclear power plants running in the state on saying, it's keeping reliable energy going to California, we have to consider what we're prioritizing here. So the question, I mean, we can say one thing, but the actions show another thing. So I would definitely say it is kind of time to say enough is enough. We know what we need to do. We know we want what we need for a renewable, clean, just energy future. So why are we settling for these in-between solutions? Why are we kind of pettering? So I think it is kind of time to say, this is what works for us. We know what to do. Let's just go for it. And I think there is some hesitancy for many reasons to moving forward at that pace. And there's also the consideration of if we're going to do this equitably, that takes time as well. Getting back the trust of communities and moving at the speed of trust with communities takes time. So there is that inherent tension as well. But that shouldn't stop us from saying, hey, let's move forward. There are some things that should not be acceptable in California, and we know that, and we should move forward on that point.
Beautiful. Thank you. Well said. Much appreciated. Tony, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, with regard to the NEM 3 decision by the CPUC, I think Becky gave an excellent nuanced answer in the chat, and I'll leave it to her. I won't comment on that. I think the states, the statewide planning efforts that have been advanced show an appreciation of the different issues. And I think, the mountain is very high and there's a lot of work to climb. And we do need to make sure we're bringing everyone along up this mountain. And it's a challenge. Today's vote that the Air District will hopefully take is going to be a great thing in that we are going to set a limit. We're going to say, okay, we have years now for us all collectively to work to make this happen in the Bay Area. And so rules like that, where we can see where we're going, there's very clear rules telling us where we're going on a certain date, I think will enable us and empower us to work together and bring everyone along. Because obviously, rules can't result in certain people not having hot water for a long list of time. I mean, that's just unacceptable. And so we need to figure out a way to bring everyone along to make that happen. And we're trying with our programs, and we'll continue to do so.
Thank you very much, Tony. And I know that Silicon Valley Clean Energy and our other partner CCAs are right at the thick of this and at the front lines of making this transition happen. Becky, what are your thoughts? Statewide, California, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, for the NEM question, for those of you who don't know, it's a tariff that's approved for solar customers so that they can basically be compensated for the electricity they provide back into the grid and into the system. I just want to acknowledge that this is a very challenging decision in California. Our historical NEM subsidy, which really did help jumpstart the solar industry and provided a good incentive for customers to install solar, it was essentially a cross subsidy. I mean, those dollars paid to customers for their solar production have to come from somewhere. They came from rates. And what that resulted in was a really regressive program policy where customers who could not afford to install solar were essentially paying through their rates to subsidize the largely wealthier customers who could afford to install solar. So I know that NEM created some winners and losers, but it did need to be reformed so that it wasn't such a regressive policy. I also know that there are a lot of folks who feel that the revised NEM policy doesn't do enough to help counter that historic disincentive and that historic regressive action, we should be really focusing on ways to make solar more affordable for our low and moderate income customers, especially our low income customers. We know that solar is one of the best ways to really make all electric buildings affordable in operation. So I'm not defending the CPUC decision. I'm just acknowledging that there are many reasons why it did need to get a closer look. And again, in regards to the second question, how do we speed things up? Is it time to bring the hammer down? I just want to push again for the concept of zonal electrification, because I know that many of the utilities, including PG&E, are really focusing on how they can speed up panel upgrade processes, how they can work through that system. But still, even with this investment and attention inside the utility, there are significant delays associated with implementing this. I agree that having targets that we can plan for really allows folks to determine where they need to make this investment, to plan into the future, and to make it possible for us to try to address some of these challenges, because it is an issue right now. Folks are looking at it. It's not helping significantly in the short term. I also really want to underscore the idea of strategies for avoiding panel upgrades, deep efficiency, new smart panels, load management devices. There are a lot of technological solutions out there. If we do better about training, incentivizing, and incorporating those into a project, hopefully that can be another strategy for reducing the delays that are introduced by some of these infrastructure upgrades.
Well, thank you so much. And Senator Becker, I want to acknowledge that you have been at the forefront of this fight for some time. And we recognize all the great work that you and all the other speakers here have done. I just want to give the last word to you in a minute or so. Like, what do you see as the path forward? How are we going to get there more quickly, more equitably, and more safely?
Yeah, well, as Becky said, actually I had years before, I had done a whole efficiency upgrade in my house before later did the electrification. Yeah, I'm trying to think how to sum up. I will just say a couple of things quickly. I mean, we're not going to relitigate the NEM issue. I mean, we had Sunrun in my office. You mentioned Sunrun. They said that a third of their customers were low-income customers before the NEM changes. But now they're going to have to adjust, and they'll do batteries on every installation. And bigger companies will be able to do that, and it'll just be solar plus batteries, and people will have backup, which is great. But it's certainly going to affect the smaller and medium-sized solar installers for sure. When you get the NEM conversation, it really gets to electricity rates, and part of the problem is we know it takes about 10 to 12 cents in kilowatt hour to produce energy and move it around California, but our rates are 37 cents to 45 cents an hour kilowatt hour, and that's because of a lot of things. But we also put all the wildfire costs in there, for example, and so we had a bill last year to try to take those out and put those in the general fund. But until we bring down electricity rates, it's really a regressive tax in many ways. Although there is the CARE program, and many people do get some benefit from the CARE program, but it's really disincentive to electrification. So that's a longer term issue for the legislature to tackle electricity rates. And we already talked about what we need to do on interconnection, and we know that's something we have to tackle this year. So again, it's sort of with the blackouts and everything, I'd say sort of 3 steps forward, 1 step back. But we got to keep moving forward. And I think this is going to be a really exciting year with all the technology, the money, the innovation, the policy, all the work that everyone here is doing. I think it's going to be a big year.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate that. And I'm going to ask everyone to stick around for just 1 or 2 more minutes. My colleague Woody Hastings has a very exciting action item we want you all to take. So Woody, go ahead.
So I know I don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to just jump right into it. Rob, if you will please drop the call to action link into the chat. Thank you. So folks, the 2022-2023 state budget cycle committed nearly $1 billion to retrofit existing buildings in low-income communities and provide consumer rebates for building upgrades. This program is essential for addressing inequities and disproportionate pollution impacts for lower-income communities and communities of color, all while ensuring robust tenant protection, anti-displacement, anti-workforce workforce standards. But Governor Newsom is proposing that 370 million in the funding for building decarbonization be delayed in the 2023-24 budget cycle, including additional reduction of 87 million planned for 25-26 that directly supports projects aimed at reducing GHG emissions from homes and advancing energy equity. With an estimated cost of $11 billion to decarbonize California's residential buildings, priority populations need investments now to avoid health impacts, bill increases, and reliability issues. So please, what the call to action that Rob is dropping into the chat allows you to quickly and easily email your representative to let them know, hey, let's maintain that budget, the funding in that budget for this critically important piece of the climate crisis puzzle. So that's pretty much it. Thank you. Duran?
Just want to note that some folks are saying it's the wrong link in the chat. The one that was dropped takes folks to back.
Wrong link in the chat. Okay, we need the call to action link, Rob. So let's get that in there, and yeah.
So perfect. So Rob will get the right link. As he's doing that, I'm just going to take a moment to thank all of our speakers, Becky for the Building Decarb Coalition, Tony from Silicon Valley Clean Energy, Fatima from the Green Lining Institute, and Senator Josh Becker from the California State Senate. We thank all of you, not just for what you've presented here today and the incredible information and inspiring words that you all shared, but for everything you do every day to help us move towards a climate safe future here in California. I just want to make sure that Rob has had a chance to drop. He's just pulling the right link in, but I want to thank our speakers. We are 2 minutes over time. I apologize for running over, but I want to thank you all for being here. I do want to emphasize to everybody that we will be sending the information on to all of you, the slideshows, the recording, the call to action link. Don't forget, endorse Climate Safe California. And the last thing I'll say, please do come join us on April 11th at the Holiday Inn in Sacramento. We're going to be right there in downtown Sacramento for the California Climate Policy Summit. It's going to be an incredible opportunity to gather together in person, just like we used to do in the old days. So I want to thank you all for being here and looking forward to the summit. If you want to stick around for the action item, you're welcome to. Otherwise, I want to thank our speakers and let you get on with your day. Thank you so much for being here. Senator Becker, Fatima, Tony, and Becky, much appreciated it. And we look forward to seeing you all again soon.